Welcome everyone. My name is Shamata. On behalf of the Calcutta Research Group, I'm extremely happy to have you all join us today. This is the third webinar of our series, Security at Crossroads, which is a series of webinars that seeks to uh, question and problematize the predominant understandings of what is security and to decolonize and also center the question of human security in the predominant majority security discourse. So in the first webinar of the series, we had carefully and closely looked at land questions of land, food and water security. In the second webinar of the series, we looked at borders and borderlands with specific focus on the EU border, on the Bangladesh-Myanmar border, as well as borderlands in Central Asia. So, and in the third webinar of the series, you've already all joined us and read the webinar note. We are going to look at questions of biopolitics, medicalization, and epidemiology today. Our moderator for the day is Professor Shomir Kumar Dash, who teaches political science at the Calcutta University, but who is also a former vice chancellor of North Bengal University, and more importantly to us, a former director of the Calcutta Research Group. Shomirda has been working extensively on India's Northeast. He's an expert in questions of ethnicity, security, rights, justice, and now increasingly, again, for our webinar, especially pertinent questions of care and protection. So I will be, and very interestingly, during the COVID-19 pandemic, he formulated something called citizenship by death, which if we have the opportunity to talk about would be excellent, but let's see whether we do it. Over to you, Shomirda, and thank you for agreeing to do this with us.
Thank you, Shamata, for that very generous introduction. Uh, good, uh, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, wherever you are. Shamata has rightly set the tune. She has given us a profile of how the seminars under this series are being held. Today, we will deliberate on the questions of biopolitics, medicalization, and epidemiology. I don't think the speakers need any introduction. They are already known by their publications. But still, to keep the seminar in perspective, I will read out their short bios, which they have shared with us. Sevastri Trubeta is a sociologist and professor of childhood and migration at the University of Applied Sciences, Magdeburg-Stendal. She has been a visiting researcher and fellow at various universities and research institutions, including the Institute for Human Sciences, IWM, Vienna, 2024, Humboldt Universität, Berlin, 2015, York University, Toronto, 2012, Princeton University, 2003. The focus of her research addresses the fields of solidarity from below, borders, migration, refugees, minorities, especially Roma, eugenics, biopolitics, medicalization, anti-racism. In 2021, she founded the working group Solidarity Citizenship, Solidarity Region Altmark. Her publications include books, edited volumes, and articles in English, German, and Greek language. For example, Physical Anthropology, Race and Eugenics in Greece, 1880s to 1970s, Medicalizing Borders, Selection, Containment, and Quarantine since 1800, etc. Imon Mitro, our second speaker, teaches history at the Department of History and Archaeology, Shiv Nadar University, Delhi, NCR. His research interests include economic history, history of economic thought, digital and platform economics, platform economies, migration and urban history. He has co-edited the book Accumulation in Post-Colonial Capitalism 2016 with Ranavir Somadar and Shomita Sen. He is also a member of the Mahanirban Calcutta Research Group. Imon has published on public health, migrant workers, and the global pandemic, urban migrant settlements, and the logistical migration during COVID-19. E.T. Abraham, as he describes himself, labors at the School of Future Innovations and Society at the Arizona State University and has previously held various positions at the National University of Singapore, the University of Texas, Austin, and the Social Science Research Council. ET's research interests include science and technology studies, biopolitics, and nuclear histories, as well as decolonial and post-colonial engagements with the Refugee Convention, as well as with science. He's an old friend of CRG. His current research is concerned with international politics of technology and science. I think that Shamata has already introduced the central theme of this webinar. So without much ado, I will request Sevasti to make her presentation. The rules of the game will be that each speaker will speak for about 17 to 18 minutes. At the 17th minute, I will just open up the window so that you get the warning shot that you need to wind up. So thank you very much. It's over to Sebastian.
Thank you very much for the introduction and especially for the invitation to this panel. So my contribution to this panel is about medicalization of borders and biosecuritization. And this presentation bases, for the most part, on my chapter on medicalized racism, which is included in the book you referred to at the beginning in the introduction, the book Medicalizing Borders, Selection, Containment, and Quarantine since 1800. I am one of the co-editors of this book that appeared in 2021 in Manchester University Press. I would like to show at least a picture of that. So today, in my presentation, the focus will be on the way medicine is integrated into border control technologies and how health and disease is interconnected with the logic of biosecurity in bordering processes. Before I address these questions, I will give a short terminological explanation of the notions of borders and medicalization, at least my understanding of these notions. So, about borders. Borders are not thought as demarcating lines to start with, not simply as geographical and state territory demarcations. I use this term borders for referring to social relations that go beyond a bipolar logic of exclusion-inclusion. So I refer to bordering processes, actually. And these bordering processes consider the borders porosity and reveal negotiations between diverse actors that include but are not limited to state or to supranational authorities. So actors include professionals in health politics, border control professionals in border controls, civil agents, and also civil society, local communities, and border crossers themselves. All of them that are involved in this field of tension where the borders are actually negotiated. Medicalization, my understanding, is based on Foucault's approaches to territory, power, disease discourses, and norms of social control. Medicine has a normative role in defining health and disease, and moreover, in shaping social relations in modernity and, I would say, in postmodernity. Moreover, medicine is incorporated in control systems. After having given this short terminological explanation, I go over to the term of medicalization of borders. This is a process of generating or reproducing borders through medical control. This is at the heart of this concept, of this notion. Medicalization of borders involves the implementation of biomedical means to control the mobility of humans animals, plants, and commerce. In my presentation and in my work generally, I consider only human mobility in the context of migration. So, historical sciences shape the notion of sanitary borders for describing the role of public health policies of nation states, international authorities, and empires in governing human mobility and regulating trade. Studies on quarantine and lazaretos at border areas are a prime example of this. But medicalization of borders is more than sanitary borders. The research on medicalization of borders is interdisciplinary. It's not only historical. Historical science, very important for the exploitation, the investigation of the medicalization of borders, but this is not. This is only one discipline. Medicalization of borders is influenced by the cultural history. I mean, the approach to medicalization of borders is influenced by the cultural history of medicine and the border studies. This is the other interdisciplinary field of studies. These approaches have led to significant epistemological shifts in our understanding of borders and medical power's role in controlling societal processes and the agency of social actors, the plurality of the actors. Meanwhile, research has illuminated the complex correlations between medical knowledge, power relations, and bordering processes across time and in different historical contexts, in colonialism, empires, nation states, international relations, and the global area of epidemics and pandemics. In our edited volume, Medicalizing Borders, we focus on 3 types of technologies for controlling human mobility to prevent the spread of disease on the European continent. This is our focus in history and the present. The one type is quarantine, the other is containment in camps, and the third one is the selection of migrants and border crossers by biomedical means. All these biomedical technologies reveal the porosity of the borders and their filtering function as an apparatus of control, selection, and classification of potential border crossers. And I will refer to this notion of filtering borders as filtering systems, this notion that is shaped by Etienne Balibar. Implementing biomedical technologies while controlling movement and selecting migrants can deterritorialize or externalize and so multiply borders. Externalization is typical for processes related to selecting migrants, in that the medical screening of the would-be migrants takes place not in the target countries, but elsewhere, most frequently in the countries of origin, for example, by health certification that has been a precondition for migration in different historical periods and was issued in the country of origins. Virtual deterritorialization of the border happens in the case of biosecurity and biometric surveillance technologies, typically. So, the approach to medicalization of borders has been further enriched by considering the interlacing of health disease with the logic of global security and especially biosecurity in national, international, and global regimes of securitization, especially from the 1990s onwards. Not by accident, this time period. In the 90s, the doctrine of the so-called asymmetrical threat gets predominant in the foreign affairs of several countries, first of all in the United States. So in this context, in this understanding, the enemy is invisible and thus omnipresent. Studies call attention to the interconnection of biomedical border control with global health regimes and show how security interacts with health and how health and security appear interwoven in the regimes of security and global health. I will refer to two aspects of these connections. The connection of issues of disease to biological warfare and especially terrorism that uses pathogenic germs as weapons. Just to give an example related to COVID-19, and this is more important from a humanitarian context, not from state affairs or war affairs. So this connection is revealed in the speech of the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, before the UN Security Council on in April 2020. Guterres warned of threats to security and opportunities for bioterrorism in association with the COVID-19 pandemics. The second aspect of the connection between regimes of security and global health is the consideration of refugees and migrants from the global south as a possible biological threat for the hosting countries of the global north. I argue that in the logic of security, the signification of disease as a biological threat emerging from the global south mediates between the biological warfare and migration and comes to represent migrants and refugees as dangerous vectors of a biological threat for the wealthy countries or the wealthy world. Such representations employ warfare terminology. The connection to security comes about as soon as refugees and immigrants are perceived in a dual characteristics as invaders in that they evade border controls and penetrate the territorial area of the Western countries. Think about this invisibility, no, and omnipresence, and as potential carriers of infectious diseases. Through these persons, the invisible threat of disease travels and transgresses borders imperceptibly. After this introduction, actually, to the topic, I will come to the conclusion that is some statements, conclusions from my work. The exercise of medical control over human mobility gives rise to the establishment or corroboration of borders that do not necessarily coincide with geographical demarcations. This happens despite the possible imposition of surveillance rules by state or supranational authorities. I gave some examples or an example of the certification, health certification as precondition for migration outside of the country of the host country, of the possible host country of the migrants. For all restrictions of human mobility or even the possible shutdown of state borders, in the logic of the global health security regimes, border remains porous. And porosity is not simply a defect, a failure that should be or could be repaired. More than this, porosity of borders acts as a driving force of securitization. At the same time, and this is exactly what brings to the light all this tension, is that porosity brings to the light the limits of control technologies on border crossing. Control plans can fail for diverse reasons, including reasons related to the resistance of those who are subject to control technologies or the lobbyists in the civil society, but also to local circumstances or at times controversial cost calculations and many other factors that could be related to professionals at the borders, professionals not only in the field of medicine, but in control technologies in surveillance technologies. And finally, the securitization of health disease issues in correlation with borders, what I described as medicalization of borders, indicates a permanent crisis. And this understanding shifts the attention from inequalities to a threatening insecurity as a permanent situation. A threatened insecurity to be managed by means that are others as medical means. In the context of migration, the threat is thought to derive from population that lives under precarious conditions in the global south. And I mean precarious conditions because of ecological injustice, because of poverty, but also post-colonial conditions of injustice. So the translation of precarity in this context into issues of security essentializes health and other disparities which are contingent on the unequal distribution of welfare at a global level. So this is my final statement, that we speak a lot about security in this context, and this is the threat to shift the focus from inequality of injustice into a situation of permanent crisis and permanent insecurity. So I think the time is over, more or less. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sebasti. Excellent. I think one or two things which could be debated at the end during Q&A. The first is how medicalization contributes to the multiplication of borders. And the second is how, for instance, the global south, and particularly people living in the global south, living under the conditions of precarity, are considered as a threat. In other words, you know that much discussion will take place focusing on how the accretion of the threat and the narrativization of the threat, and how it casts a spell across the world. And the third question, of course, is your point that the geographical border, the divergence between the geographical border and the border that medicalization enforces. I think that that's also something which will be debated in course of Q&A. Our next speaker is Dr. Iman Mitra. So it's over to Iman.
Thank you, Shobita. Thank you, CRG and Shomata in particular, for inviting me for this very interesting webinar. So I have a PPT which I'm going to share now. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk about this particular theme, digital epidemiology and socialization of risk. Few observations. This is based on a book article which I recently published in 2024. The book is called The Long 2020 Reflections of Epidemiological Times, edited by Subhash Ranjan Chakraborty, Paula Banerjee, and Kostubuni Sengupta. It came out of a research project that CRG took charge of in 2021, and I was part of the project. My chapter is called The Island of the Day After, Digital Epidemiology, Artificial Intelligence, and the Biopolitics of Future. I'm going to summarize the chapter pertaining to today's theme, and also I'm going to add a little bit towards the end. So basic premise of the chapter is this. It argues how the response to COVID-19 assumed a rhetoric of war and a narrative of preparedness to envision and sustain an idea of biopower based on logistical governance. And then logistics, in this context, I'm taking it from Benjamin Bratton's introduction to Virilio's, a new edition of Virilio's Speed and Politics, published in 2006, where logistics is the preparation for war through the transfer of the nation's potential to its armed forces in time of peace as in times of war. So this new vision puts its bet on the emerging disciplinary practice called digital epidemiology. Now, what is digital epidemiology? So, digital epidemiology is defined by Lucas Engelman, who runs a very interesting blog called Somatosphere. So, according to this definition, digital epidemiology focuses on near real time surveillance of the epidemic, come pandemic, while it keeps emerging, circumventing dated and excruciatingly slow reporting chains from frontline physicians to laboratories to national reporting institutes and clearing centers to the World Health Organization. The disruptive promise of digital epidemiologists is attractive. Any ongoing epidemic could be inferred directly and seamlessly from the global data exhaust collected from what people do and what traces they leave online. Now, one of the best examples of the deployment of digital epidemiology during the pandemic was this one of the earliest articles published on COVID 19. It was published in March 2020. Pneumonia of unknown etiology in Wuhan, China, potential for international spread via commercial air travel. This was published in Journal of Travel Medicine. And one of the authors, and we will come to him, is Kamran Khan. Interestingly, this journal article was submitted on 8th of January. It was revised on 9th of January and accepted on 10th of January, and then it came out in a couple of months. So this quick response, I'm going to argue, is very important because this kind of response time is, I think, unheard of in the history of publication of journals in any field. Now, the study, the paper argues, examines 2018 travel data generated from the International Air Transport Association to quantify passenger volumes originating from the international airport in Wuhan, China between January and March, and inclusive of some other data, and correlates it with infectious disease vulnerability index IDVI of the regions to which these flights took off. Now, this IDVI, very interestingly, is prepared by Melinda Moore and her colleagues on behalf of the RAND Corporation and published in RAND Health Quarterly in 2017 to help the Department of Defense, the Department of Health and Human Services, for example, through the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, the US Agency for International Development, and the international community more broadly. Now, I don't have to tell this audience what the RAND Corporation is. So there is a very crucial connection between what organizations, think tanks like RAND corporations are envisioning and what the new discourse on digital epidemiology is trying to do. And that is based on, so this is what I'm calling the big data moment in history of epidemiology, where epidemiology enters the domain of big data analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and deep tech. So Kamran Khan, who was one of the authors of the paper on COVID-19, is the founder of Blue Dot, a Canadian health monitoring platform, which warned its clients of an epidemic in the making a week before even the official WHO notification came out. Blue Dot has developed, according to Khan, who gave an interview to Wire in January, Blue Dot has developed a disease surveillance analytic program which uses natural language processing and machine learning techniques to sift through news reports in 65 languages, along with airline data and reports of animal disease outbreaks. So it was this data which was used in that paper which Kamran wrote with his colleagues from Blue Dot and published in March 2020. So clients of Blue Dot include the Canadian government, Air Canada, and ASEAN, along with many other private corporations. So what I argued in the paper is this, that we have also entered a domain of a new epistemology. Rather than the older regimes of census and survey modalities, where the data was collected and worked upon as an objective mass of unruly observations, the regime of big data and AI focuses on interfacing between disparate elements, logics, and knowledge systems, whereby the data itself acquires an experiential sovereignty, a mnemonic autonomy, where prediction becomes identical with analysis and not its incidental consequence. In machine learning, the predictions are made not simply by making causal connections between pre-existing trends and current situations. It happens by what I'm calling representing the future as if the present is a fulfillment of the potential of the future and not the other way around. So a lot of literature which started coming out in the early 2020 and also in 2021 was not really very interested in the question of what is the nature of this new pneumonia that they were talking about, or what should be the immediate treatment or whatever. They were much more interested in finding out the trajectory of the virus and how the interception between the trajectory of the virus and trajectories of human beings are happening, and how that can be stopped. And that was the main thrust of the paper that we just saw, and that was the thrust of many other papers which came up after this. What I am going to argue is happening here is a socialization of risk. So, digital epidemiology of this sort works well with the neoliberal idea of the market as an autonomous information processor. This idea of the market as an autonomous information processor was first introduced by Milton and Rose Friedman in 1980, and it was then taken up by many other neoliberal thinkers in arguing that the market is constantly sending signals, and it is our duty to read those signals, but not everybody can read the signals. There are people who have to train themselves in reading the signals. So this neoliberal way of inhabiting the world, I would argue, is through socialization of risk by adopting the logics of financial instruments like securities and derivatives in our everyday decisions. So thus we can separate ourselves as risk takers from those who are at risk. So essentially what this kind of an epidemiology is asking, that through access to this big data exhaust, and by reading the signals which are coming off these exhausts, one has to understand, one has to sort of fashion the self, the subjectivity of oneself, in the sense that they are willing to take certain risks, and they're not willing to, and then willing to not take certain risks. By fashioning oneself as a subject, as a risk-taking subject, we are constantly supposed to separate ourselves from people who are perennially at risk. So, and I argued this in the paper as well. This is an extension of Foucault's model of modern biopower, which he discussed in Security, Territory, and Population, where case, risk, danger, and crisis, this particular model, to the domain of finance capital in a neoliberal world. So the domain of the world of finance capital and the world of epidemiology are in a conversation in which this kind of self-fashioning of the neoliberal subject is constantly happening. So I'm not saying that epidemiology is basing itself on this model, or finance capital is basing itself on the model of epidemiology, but what I'm trying to suggest is that they are constantly in conversation with each other. The same logic permeates the new imperial wars of preemption, war against terror, which we have been seeing continuing for a while now, where one has to hit the target before they're hit themselves, and one has to preempt the attack, and then by using that logic, one has to continue this particular war. So enemies, and this is something I'm quoting from Randy Martin's book called The Empire of Indifference, which was published in 2007. So enemies are to be defeated before they can make their antagonism manifest. And the same thing we saw, the same rhetoric was being used in case of the coronavirus as well. The uniqueness of the response to COVID-19, therefore, springs from this convergence between epidemiological and financial or economic reasons that shape the neoliberal subject of our time. So, at the concluding part of this presentation, I would like to mention something that Benjamin Bratton has written recently, and again in 2021, in this book called The Revenge of the Real, where he wants to move from this, what I'm calling socialization of risk, to collectivization of risk. So this collectivization is an idea where we are not supposed to separate ourselves as risk takers from the people who are constantly at risk, but the risk is rather distributed among a large group of people in terms of their interconnectivity. The interconnectivity is subject to an understanding of the human body as a biochemical assemblage, where the humanity is not an exclusivist essence, but a site of cohabitation of many life forms, including the virus. This calls, what Bratton argues, for an archival paradigm of data, a very long-term multivariate samples of relevant phenomena over very long periods of time at a planetary scale, which is inclusive and entangled, which, according to him, is suggesting towards a biopolitics of future. Now, my question here would be, and I not necessarily have any answer to that, what happens to the state? Because in the response to COVID-19, although much of the literature is not talking about it, we saw a very important role played by the state, not only as an institution which would be managing the medical surveillance, which would be asking people to behave in a certain way, but also as the agency which would provide the huge infrastructure for the data exhaust from which this kind of digital epidemiology would emerge. Now, what happens to the idea of the state? What happens to the role of the state in this kind of a biopolitics of future is a question that I would like to ask. And this question becomes immensely important because I wrote this article in 2021, and 2 years, 3 years have passed since then. And I tried to update it for this presentation. And this is the only question which came to my mind, which probably needs more thinking. Because like in the last 3 years, we could see that the states, the imperial states and the warring states, the states of various kinds in various parts of the world, are becoming more and more interested in the question of the data and in the question of the data infrastructure. And it seems that without the state, the possibility of creating the logistical networks, the possibility of creating the huge infrastructure which would sustain this data exhaust is not possible. So the archival paradigm of data that Breton is talking about. We know that the colonial state itself was an archival state in a sense. How is this archival paradigm of data would negotiate with the question of the archival nature of both the colonial and the post-colonial state remains a very important question to my mind. And we can take up this question in the discussion as well. Thank you for your patience with the problems that I was having with the PPT. And this ends my presentation. And thank you.
Thank you, Iman. Three quick things which come to my mind. The first is that how institutional practices fashion the digital epidemiology. I would just ask you that if we could sort of upend the question. In other words, is digital epidemiology fashioning the institutional practices, or it's the other way around? So the exact connection between digital epidemiology on the one hand and the institutional practices, and particularly you have referred to RAND Corporation. So if you could elaborate more on that. The second is that how, for instance, the usual linear time gets fractured. In other words, you have said that the prediction becomes the analysis. In other words, it also, in a way, disturbs the linearity of time, the known linearity of time. And my third question is, for instance, that how, are we actually assigning too much of importance to the modern state in handling the data? Yes, it is amassing the data, gathering data, but what about coordinating the data? And what about, for instance, responding to the kind of huge data load, I would say, probably data overload. And there are many irrelevant data that the state is loaded with. So what do you do with them? In other words, you need how much the modern states are doing in terms of processing the data. Not all states are efficient in handling the kind of data that they have. Sometimes you have data leakage, particularly the COVID data, for instance. The COVID site allegedly was hacked in India, for instance. So all these questions will come up probably, I'm sure, during the discussion. Our next speaker is Professor E.T. Abraham. So it's over to E.T.
Thank you, Shomir. Thank you to CRG for its very kind invitation. I'm always happy to take part in these discussions because they allow me a degree of freedom compared to the usual discussions that take place to try new ways of thinking, to experiment with new ideas. And this presentation today is very much in that spirit of one that is trying to explore new ideas. And so I'm quite sure that it is incomplete in a variety of ways, but I hope it will give us some thoughts for further discussion. The title of my presentation today is Biopolitics Meets biophysics, securitization from the analog to the quantum. Okay, let me begin by talking about the internal contradictions of securitization as a way of, as an ideology. Securitization creates insecurities. Security is never alone. It always travels with its inseparable partner, insecurity. Security seeks to reduce insecurity by managing, ordering, and ranking real and possible threats to the social order. And my two predecessor speakers have spoken directly to that issue. It is built around the management, measurement, and containment of risk, alongside the production of imaginable scenarios of threat and danger. In other words, the working of the security project requires and enables the production of insecurities as a necessary feature of the security project. Second point, and this is where I'm just beginning from because I want to move away from this way of thinking. Securitization is not primarily concerned with care and protection of the disenfranchised and the vulnerable. Securitization is a project that begins from the imposition of boundaries around the social body. Territorialization of the social body is necessary in order to define the limits of the securitization project. The imposition of territorial boundaries creates centers and peripheries as a condition of its formation. In other words, securitization creates marginal subjects, not only on the territorial border, even as it seeks to control the perceived disruptive impact of these subjects. So two very simple points to start with. Insecurities are created through the project of securitization. Margins are created through the project of securitization. Okay, this should be, I think, familiar to most of you, so I'm not going to dwell on it any further. The biopolitical project is a modernist project that has remarkable similarities to the project of securitization. It too creates boundaries, measures risks, and imagines fearful futures with the avowed intent of ensuring the successful reproduction of the population, a territorialized social body. Biopolitics is thus a project of desire, in this case, more often than not, state desire, which opens the door to psychoanalytic treatment, which, if I'm not mistaken, has not been effectively carried out to date. Biopolitics is built around the status fantasy of omniscient knowledge, to know fully and completely who and what lies within the boundaries of the population. Biopolitics seeks the conversion of information to state knowledge. Its manifestation takes the form of a database, whether real or virtual, where information is converted into knowledge through the application of an ordering algorithm. More can be said here, but for the sake of time, I will just quickly move on to the idea of the database society. The third point is then database society. Through the concept of population, biopolitics inaugurates the idea of the database society. Database society should not be confused with the concept of modern society in the sense used by classical sociologists such as Max Weber or Emil Durkheim, or the social formations that lie within and across national territorial boundaries, so-called borderland communities. In the database society, society emerges from the database, always already ordered in some manner, although not always visible. The first database was, of course, the census, meaning that this desire dates back to the Babylonians in 3800 BCE. Biopolitics is not new, in other words, but the categories and technologies used to build databases always reflect the moment of their creation. Databases are not innocent collections of information. They are also never complete. They are always also a project of ordering, built around meta-categories that constitute ranking, hierarchy, legality, and precedence of the social body. It is through categories that the social body becomes visible or objective to itself. New categories produce new forms of social difference. Further, each advance in the technology of the database allows new insights into the social body, or more accurately, they offer insight into the new social bodies they have created. Foucault's breakthrough was to realize that reliance on statistics to interrogate and order the database and its categories produces fixed ideas of what and who is normal. It reminds us that the idea of the normal is a product of the database, not the other way around. In some cases, the normal is explicit. In other cases, we only discover the norm when the order of the database is disrupted, as for an example, when a crisis breaks out. A recent example would be, and this goes back to Iman's presentation as well, would be the sudden appearance of urban migrant populations when COVID-19 lockdowns forced migrants to leave the invisible informal sector where they had lived and worked. Or to take another example from some years ago, when hitherto invisible migrants from the Northeast returned home due to the escalation of physical threats to their existence in mainland India. Databases have no inherent narrative order. When modernist politics imposes an order that begins from the desire for security, it requires in turn the identification of what makes society insecure. Not surprisingly, nature, most often in the form of disease and starvation, was considered the earliest threat to the social order. Threats to society have only expanded since that time, coming to include, of course, human threats today. Both biopolitics and securitization come from a common fear of the irregular, unorthodox, deviant, and criminal. Early modes of the database began with and were justified by the need to identify and contain these bodies, now read as threats. From the creation of the database, society became infected by fear of its breakdown. Every technological and physical extension of the database brought new ideas of danger closer to the desired idea of society. The inherent limit of the database, and by extension society, is the idea of society as always a latent criminal body. Modern database society began as an effort that is hard to separate from the colonial project, with all that that implies. Some of you may be familiar with the story of how fingerprinting began in colonial Bengal as a way of weeding out false positives from pension payments. This was unquestionably an analog era, a moment akin to the period of classical physics. Today, we are faced with the database in a world where the dominant technology is digital or virtual, expanding the boundaries of the database in unforeseen ways, generating the production of categorical combinations that exceed our understanding and indeed our language. With this technological transformation, we can no longer consider the social purely in analog terms. It requires what I will call a quantum understanding of the social and its futures. So what I'm calling a quantum understanding of the social seeks to capture the duality of the desire for order, insecurity, and security, and the need to reference multiple sources of threat to society, especially via threats to the boundaries that contain the population. Quantum understandings of the database effectively deterritorialize the idea of the bounded population, reminding us that the securitization project remains trapped in an analog conception of territoriality. That is why, to return to my beginning, securitization is no longer fit for purpose in my view. To go a step further, not to consider this limit traps our understanding within an analog territorial viewpoint, returning us to the past in effect, making any project of humane and progressive social change anachronistic and out of place. Threats to the boundaries of the population come from sources of insecurity, both external and internal. External factors include most obviously natural causes. These may be both micro, consider viruses, and macro, most obviously climate change. They also include internal causes, which can be crudely captured by the larger label of politics. Politics in the quantum present is most visible as resistance to the neoliberal order, which may or may not have a discernible or stated purpose or telos, but is nevertheless radical in its potential for disruption to the prevailing order. This is no longer a question of left or right politics, both of which are deeply analog and modern ways of seeing, but something more profound and radical. Here I need only mention recent populist upheavals in South Asia, taking place in two countries that are notable for the size and the importance of their diasporic or unbounded national populations. Sri Lanka, starting with the Aragalaya, where a nationalist right-wing party now promises to bring progressive change, and Bangladesh, the so-called monsoon revolution, led by an unstable coalition of civil society actors and the informal sector, both that overthrew the existing political order, upending unstable hierarchies, and setting both countries on a path that is still very unclear and uncertain, precisely because we lack the categories through which to read and understand what is taking place at our current moment. Inequality and corruption, the rhetorical foundations that were calling for change in both countries, are better seen as symptoms of entropy in social affairs, outcomes and practices that are particularly visible to the disenfranchised, while being considered signs of a functioning system by those who benefit. The quantum has a further demand for us to consider: the simultaneity of the dualized subject. In a quantum world, order cannot be separated from disorder. The normal joins the abnormal. The regular is juxtaposed against the irregular. Securitization and fixed boundaries are possible projects only in an analog frame of reference. The quantum turn upsets these certainties by insisting on both sides of this duality, not one or the other alone. The postcolonial conception of ambivalence, not one but both at the same time, is now the norm for the natural, the political, and the social, as it has always been, but which social scientists habitually chose not to see or to accept. These are, to my mind, tragic errors of both commission and omission. If not securitization, then what? That is the question for this community to consider. I don't claim to have the answer. I can only speak to the problem, stated as clearly as I can. I am sure that this formulation will not appeal to everyone, but in my view, the need is to begin from these conditions, embracing the multiplicity in our concepts, questioning the obviousness of the left and right poles of politics, foregrounding the margin over the center, seeing the breakdown of established boundaries as an opportunity, not a threat. It asks the question of what biopolitics means, and indeed what justice means, when we dissolve the categorical distinctions between human and natural worlds, between animate and inanimate things. To conclude, the bio is what is missing from biopolitics. When disorder is privileged over order, when uncertainty trumps risk management, we enter the space of the quantum Anthropocene. At a minimum, it demands thoughtful consideration of entropy in human affairs. The question then is, are we ready to come to terms with and to celebrate, not to fear, a biopolitics that begins from social thermodynamics? And to close, and what does justice mean in such a moment? Thank you.
Thank you, E.T. Excellent, as always. But I think that I just flagged two issues which are likely to be debated. One is your idea that it's the database which brings into existence the society, not the other way around. And the second, your distinction, which I guess has been done in surgically precise terms between analog society and the quantum society. The surgical precision might be a problem. In other words, you know that the governmentality might make it imperative that it's an intelligent mix between the two, A, and B, that why should we think that that the database that is assembled is so organized that it actually could bring into existence a society. In other words, you know that are there fault lines in the data themselves, and they might not contribute to the formation of a cohesive society. That's all that I have to say at this moment. Now, I guess that the discussions, the presentations are now open for discussion.
I have a question or an inquiry for Sevasti. So my question would be that in the 19th century, let's say, we thought that miasma was the chief cause for the spread of the disease, infectious diseases. And let's say with regard to, therefore, borders and how to draw the boundaries of the spread of a disease, so we had to have some answer to miasma. Now, today we say that this theory of the foul smell and all that, it's a bad theory, it's a wrong theory, and David Arnold has also written on how in the colonial time we thought of the spread of malaria for various reasons. Now, in the COVID-19, again, we said that miasma was a wrong theory. It has been proved to be wrong. And now we think that the virus spreads because of other reasons, and it is different from bacteriological diseases, etc. But then we also know that with several flying theories about the spread of the virus, I am only referring to one of the sadhus of India, I'm forgetting his name, who specializes in manufacturing different products. What's his name? Shomir, you might be able to remind me. Who has this?
Baba Ramdev.
Baba Ramdev. So Baba Ramdev challenged anyone to disprove that he would be eating, and if you keep your throat and everything okay, and if you just be sure that that everything goes to your food pipe, then you are free. And all you have to do is therefore to keep your throat proper. And to keep your throat proper, you may have, warm water treatment. But the main thing was that you should drink regularly so that you are free. You can take coffee, and there were various things. So, Sevasti, I want to ask you that given the kind of scientific knowledge today on virus, so would you say that this is also very provisional about what we thought about the reason of the spread of COVID-19, this exceptionally fast spread of COVID-19? And therefore, the kind of borders, because my insidious suggestion is that in COVID-19, more borders melted rather than, the number of new borders were created, because COVID-19 couldn't allow or didn't allow the creation of all those things, except China, others regarding China, or China erecting a 3-year-old kind of prohibition of all kinds, including restrictions on Chinese citizens, etc. So what would be your response to that? So is the present thesis as provisional as the one around miasma? I will, Shomir, I will not speak much, but I want to
Please carry on.
I have one question for Imon also. Can I tell it now, or should I?
Yeah. Please.
Yeah. To Imon, you had been going great, but since you had to discontinue with your slide presentation, do you think there is a disjunction or there is a discontinuity between your analysis of how statistics and the science of statistics, the statistical models, the emergence of the big data, etc., and what you said in the later part of your presentation, that there is the continuity suffers? My own feeling was that probably it needs more linkages. And to ET, I had your first slide where you had said that security is based on creating insecurities. This is what is written. Am I wrong? I'm right. But when you are telling almost that security creates insecurity or carries along. My own sympathy lies with your former formulation. I do think that our sense of injustice creates justice. There is no positive definition of these things. There is no positive definition of security. So that is one critique that I have of Foucault, that actually our formulations of insecurity and our awareness of what we consider to be insecurity at a certain point of time then gives rise to our notions of security. But so, Imon, I just wanted to ask you that instead of going into the, the whatever you said in the later part of your thing, why didn't you push your arguments on the whole enmeshing of statistical sciences and the epidemiological sciences a little more, because you have worked so much on that?
Thank you. That came out well in his abstract as well.
Okay, thank you very much for this question, Ranabir. Yes, the historians have dealt with miasma theory in several publications. So, and according to this miasma theory, disease causation are related to environmental emanation. So, and miasma is a form of bad air and like that. So, but this theory is one that it was really very important in the European context where I know better. It was until the period of the Habsburg monarchy, for example, but then it was replaced by the contagianism. No miasma, but contagion is the cause of disease. So, but in any case, even in that period, the different theories coexisted. And this is the very important thing, I think, because it is very usual that different theories coexist in the same period. As for the current time, I would not say that miasma theory is active or has an influence, but there is another point, and this is that disease, like health issues, have metaphorical notion, metaphorical significance. And the question is in how far all this metaphorical significance that is really powerful is transformed and transmitted and exist until our period, not as scientific knowledge, but as an idea. So, and this would be my answer to your question, that it is actually a question. So, in how far this idea of miasma is still active in these discourses about health and disease, but not as a scientific knowledge anymore.
Thank you. Iman?
Yeah, thank you so much for all the questions, actually. And I would like to engage with some of the points that Shomirda also mentioned. And I would start with Ranubita's question, and I would probably try to address some of the questions that Shomirda was asking through that response. So I am not necessarily suggesting that there is a discontinuity with the earlier regime. For example, some of the methods, of course, are to be there, are to exist, because, for example, correlation. This is a kind of statistical method which would be used in today's analysis of data as well. What I'm suggesting is that in the earlier model of in earlier probabilistic models, there is a causality which runs from the past to the present to the future. The linearity of causality is very much chronological in the traditional sense. What is happening in these new models, especially the kind of models which are becoming popular or which became popular during the pandemic within the discourse of digital epidemiology, is that they are sort of, as I was saying, Shomirda, fracturing the linearity of time in a sense that they are thinking in terms of preemption. So most of these models are trying to predict the moment of contact between a human agent and the virus, and that is supposed to happen in the future. So we always heard that prevention is better than cure. In this new discourse, preemption is better than cure. So the whole idea is actually to predict the future as if it is playing out in the present. And what I'm trying to also suggest, that this is not something which is happening only within this particular discursive space of digital epidemiology or epidemiology in general, but it has been continuing for a while within the ambit of financial capitalism, and of course within the ambit of the war against terror. Preemption has become, and that is that this is a long history of that from the since the end of the Second World War, where preemption, and Rand Corporation is one of the organizations which specializes in this kind of analysis, where preemption of the enemy attack becomes the most important or most fundamental aspect of war strategy. So war against COVID or war against coronavirus specifically is assuming that kind of a logic, which then they are trying to inform which they are trying to then put in the idea of statistical analysis, which I am not very sure whether happened before, because this could happen only with a particular patterning of the data sets, which wouldn't have been possible without the technological advancements which have been made in the recent years in artificial intelligence. Because the way AI can sift through a huge amount of data, that wasn't possible for the computational machines that we used to have before. Now the techniques and technology of computation has improved a lot. So this is a particular moment, I would say, which I'm calling the big data moment, which is different from the earlier moments in that sense. Because of certain technological innovations, we are seeing a very different kind of analytical deployment of chronology itself, which was not happening in these particular fields, which were probably happening in other fields, but now it has become much more interdiscursive. That would be my response. I don't know whether it was very clear or not. But the other question, which I think is a very important question, is the question of the institutional practices and the question of the state. So I think COVID-19, or the period of the pandemic, was a big accelerator in two ways. One is the big accelerator for creation of certain logistical networks which didn't exist before. So I teach and stay in a university which is at the back of the beyond. So it was only during the COVID pandemic, more and more delivery services started coming to our university premises, which I didn't say before. This this continued, and this happened because this was the time between 2020 and 2024. I live in the state of Uttar Pradesh in India. The government of Uttar Pradesh has taken up multiple, like more than 20 probably, projects of highway building and that kind of infrastructure building. So there the state becomes very important in providing not only the infrastructure, also in case of big data infrastructure, I would say. And these two are connected, the logistical networks and the big data infrastructure. And both are not possible without an active involvement of the state. So that is one point. The other point is that the state is actively now campaigning for digital literacy rather than the older forms of literacy that you're talking about. I've been working on this for a while now in the financial sector, especially. For example, the popularity of QR code, and QR means quick response, which has been the quick response has been the mantra during the COVID response as well. So the popularity of QR code happened actively with the support of the government since 2016 with demonetization. So there are spaces in which the state, in which certain institutions become very important. But it would be obviously wrong to argue that digital epidemiology is being inspired by the state, or the state is other inspired by these discourses. They're happening simultaneously, and it's very difficult also to sometimes distinguish each institution from the other institution. So there are networks of institutions which are acting together. So right now, this is what I have, but I'm happy to respond to other questions if there is any.
E.T.?
Shomir, thanks for your question. Ronabir, also thanks for your question. First, let me try and clarify. I don't think there's actually that much difference between what Ronabir was saying and what I was saying. In that, I do believe that the idea of securitization, and this is different from security, produces insecurities or threats to security in order to do its job properly. So we have to see it as a state project, or it could be other agencies as well, but let's see it as a project that doesn't exist until the goal of security is predicated as the ultimate reason for any state or others to exist. In that process, the identification of risk, the identification of threats, the demarcation of the boundaries, all go towards saying, what is a danger, what is a threat to the existing order? How can we ensure that the existing order reproduces itself? We have to, as others have also said, we have to identify these threats in advance, and we have to cope with them in some way. So in that sense, I do mean that securitization as a project generates its own insecurities, which it then proceeds to deal with. That doesn't mean that, quote unquote, real insecurities or real threats are always identifiable. I think this is the importance of COVID and these other shocks to the system, where they exceed, you might say, the imagination of state managers and those who are concerned with the production of security. And yet, once it has happened, it gets incorporated within the larger framework of the need to securitize. Biopolitics is a slightly different question, of course, closely related. And here, if you accept the premise, as I'm trying to suggest, of the database society, the importance, I think, to keep in mind, the important factor to keep in mind is that the database by itself does not tell a story. You need to impose a logic, or what we today would call an algorithm, across the database in order to see the content of the database for what it is. In other words, it's always the imposition of the algorithm that produces narrative order. The database by itself, in a sense, tells no story until some work is done on it. The kind of work that is being done on the database is, in this case, the work of securitization. In other words, questions of care, questions of vulnerability are not included within that schema, within that framework. Rather, it is the generation of the political economy, institutions, and others, which allow the society as it is constituted or understood today to reproduce itself. So database society is, on the one hand, a way of saying there is a desire, and this word, I think I want to keep coming back to this, there is a desire for knowing, there's a desire for knowledge, there's a desire to contain, there's a desire to collect. All of these come together. The form in which it comes will change over time. What was true in Babylonian era is not true in the colonial era, is not true today. Technologies have changed, ways of seeing have changed. But in every case, what we end up understanding society to be is a function of the order, the categories, and the demarcations we impose upon the database itself. That's what I mean by saying society follows from the database, is not prior to it. Shomi raises a critical question, I think, with the question of the analog and the quantum. And are these, in fact, is this, in fact, a shift in qualitative shift or something else? I'm completely in favor of the idea that there is, in fact, a blurring of the boundaries between what we could call the analog and the digital, not the quantum, because in a sense, what we are seeing today is the life of everyday life or real life or whatever you want to call it, and the virtual bleeding into one another in a variety of different and complicated ways. That is very much the case in terms of how the current moment is predicated. But when I raise the question of quantum, I'm really asking about the kinds of categories that we're using in order to understand how the database is or isn't working, how securitization is or isn't functioning, what biopolitics means or should mean. And in that case, I would say that it's the need for the duality of these concepts, which is the critical one at this moment going forward. We can't afford the moment we say order over disorder, we are falling back into the securitization trap, into the modernist trap. When we acknowledge disorder and order existing simultaneously, then we are in a position to elevate those, shall we say, disenfranchised or marginal characters, marginal subjects, into a place where they can be in dialogue with what may be called the center or the core, in a way that doesn't automatically distance them or demarcate them or separate them or stigmatize them in a way that we obviously would not want if the meaning of security is to mean care and overcoming vulnerability. Right, what I'm trying to say. The database produces society, securitization produces insecurities. The line between the analog and the virtual is inherently blurred. We go back and forth between them, but we don't have a conceptual apparatus currently which allows us to shift back and forth between these lines, or these imagined lines that I'm imposing, unless we adopt what I'm calling quantum. And I don't mean quantum physics, I mean rather the idea of simultaneous duality, or ambivalence, an old post-colonial term, as our normal practice and way of seeing. I hope that makes some sense, or I haven't confused matters even more.
Pramota has a question. Why don't you ask it yourself?
Okay, I will read out what I wrote. So I have a question to all three panelists. How do these connected yet different accounts of contemporary biopolitics take into account the already bodily vulnerable? I assume with borders, as the would-be US president had declared in his previous tenure, ill people are unwelcome migrants. At the same time, the notion of risk for people considered to be vulnerable, compromised, or with comorbidities, as we learned during COVID-19, is different. So our notion of risk for them is different from what otherwise risk is considered to be. In fact, their vulnerable bodies help us frame what is risk to the healthy individuals. So, and finally, would the quantum Anthropocene be kinder to the epidemiologically vulnerable? So, what I'm basically requesting you is to reflect within the framework that you have proposed and very wonderfully demonstrated, what is the position of the epidemiologically vulnerable?
I would like to respond to Samata's question, and I believe to respond to a part of your question, Samir, in that. And first of all, I'm very careful with the notion of vulnerability, because one has to consider this notion in the institutional frame of protection, of no refugees, but protection of border crossers, actually. So this is an institutional term. What is about disability in this context? This is exactly what I meant with the externalization of the borders, the selection processes. And the other thing is that we have to consider this question of Samata raised in historical context. And it is very, very different in the different contexts, but in the context of the bordering processes, all these historical contexts in the modern period, in the modern era and postmodern era, have a common denominator, and this is that it is a part of the selection processes. So what I mean, this is exactly the function of the certification system I mentioned in my presentation, my statement. Health certification is thought also for excluding persons and people with disabilities in very different historical contexts. And I will give you an example. For Paul Weidling, the historian and co-editor of our volume, has investigated the transport of Jewish children from Vienna in September 1939. And he came to the conclusion that children who were disability were excluded from transport to Great Britain, to UK, actually. And they were left behind. So because of the disabilities. And this selection process is the principle of the certification, health certification in the context of migration. At the same time, there is an opposite, let me say, an opposite trend. And we speak about medical humanitarianism. And in the context of medical humanitarianism, vulnerability in terms of disability or signs of disability in the body of people is a reason for be allowed to stay in the host country at least for a short period of time. So, and they are two different, let me say, two different trends, but the principle is that this disability, this, as you said, Samata, vulnerability should be visible in the body of the person. So, and this is not so easy to respond to this question, but it is involved biopolitics in any case, nicht? It is and many other aspects that are not connected directly with securitization, but with classical topics of the worth of life.
Thank you, Sevasti.
May I?
Iman,
Yeah, thank
Iman,
you.
you have an additional question which has been posted on the chat box.
This question is from Shupratik. Just a comment following Iman sir's observation that COVID-19 pandemic helped bringing logistics closer to people's homes. Is this not associated with the simultaneous disenfranchisement of people struggling with digital literacy, people who don't know how to use QR codes, for example? Is this then an instance of intensifying the marginalization of certain subjects?
So you address both the questions together, Iman.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for both the questions, and both the questions are very important. Shravanata, of course, within the ambit of digital epidemiology, there is an active process of invisibilizing the vulnerable. And that is why I think it's important to relate it to the simultaneous discourse of financialization of every day, in which what I was saying, the separation between the risk takers and the people at risk are happening. To give an example, during the pandemic, the way the migrants were treated in India, that's a perfect example of how, let's say, the middle class risk takers who are kind of trained and well conversed in a particular way of living, in a particular way of being, were separated from the people who are sort of, who were thought to be, would always be at risk, and therefore nobody needs to care for them. Nobody needs to give any damn about them. So that was one way of doing it. But at the same time, one could see that this is in response to the second half of your question, the quantum Anthropocene, or what Benjamin Bratton is calling the biopolitics of future, whether it would be kinder to the epidemiologically vulnerable. Again, Bratton is very optimistic that it would be, because here we are talking about sort of a cohabitation of different life forms, etc., and reimagination of a post-humanist society. But my hunch is that the state has already become post-humanist to kind of respond to this kind of very positive thinking that some people are thinking in terms of sort of resistance to the logic of the state. So I'm not very hopeful how that would be actually, that would lead to some kind of a kinder treatment of the people who are, because without the people who are always already at the risk, without the people who are the homo sacer of our time, it is impossible to actually self-fashion oneself as a risk taker. Against whom are we going to fashion ourselves as neoliberal subjects? So I know that this is sort of it's a kind of a dark answer, but anyway, right now that's the only thing that I have. And in response to Shupratik's question, this is a very important question, and I agree with you that it is a kind of act of simultaneous disenfranchisement which is happening, and it's kind of in continuation with the response that I gave Shomata right now. But at the same time, there is an attempt by the government to enfranchise more and more people. So now, for example, the government is thinking in terms of voice-based interfaces where you don't need to have smartphone. We have already seen that in case of, so initially when these food delivery systems started, the food delivery companies insisted that you need to have a scooter, at least a motorized vehicle to, provide the food, like deliver the food. But at the same time, now we are seeing that more and more carriers are coming on bicycles. Now, so there is also an expansion of this space happening, and that will definitely push some people to more marginalization. There is no doubt about that. But these processes are happening simultaneously. So how to use QR codes? More people are probably being trained to use the QR codes in India right now. Every time I come to Calcutta, I discover more and more shops now have QR codes than before. So it's expanding. At the same time, you are right that more and more people would be disenfranchised in the process in various other ways, if not in terms of QR codes, in some other ways. But anyway, thank you for both the questions.
Ite?
I'm trying to summarize what I'm still working through in my head in a way that may be useful for the project that CRG is concerned with. The question of securitization and the question of biopolitics and their relationship to each other. So I've tried to outline in what I said the connections between the two, the similarities between the two, in terms of risk management, population boundedness, creation of threats, creation of distinctions between people. Now, the question, I will return the question to those of you who have been thinking about this to say, what is at stake in the use of this term securitization today, when we know it belongs to a certain moment in time, a certain project, which was never intended to be one of concern with care, vulnerability, and protection. So why should we be surprised that today what we see under the label of securitization excludes the many who should be protected by a good state or in a system of better justice, right? Let me just back up a second and see whether we can see this in a slightly different way. Some years ago, I had the opportunity, sitting in the UNHCR archives in Geneva, to read the refugee status determination forms belonging to 3 generations of refugees, from the 50s, from the 70s, and from the 90s. You'd be shocked to see, or maybe you wouldn't be shocked to see, that in the 50s, the overwhelming ethos and sort of trope of the questions being asked of those seeking refuge, all European, all seeking to come to the New World, was one of care, of concern, of protection, of overcoming vulnerability. In other words, it was the ideal type of refugee determination status procedure that you would want. How are you doing? I'm sorry for your loss. I care about you. How can we protect you? That was the theme. By the 70s, with the new arrival of different kinds of refugees, especially from Africa, the tone has changed already. By the time we get to the 90s, it is all about suspicion, hostility, doubt, questioning, rejection. The smallest mistake that they would make in the telling of their story of who they are would lead to denial of refugee status. What has happened in between the period of the 1950s and the 1990s, I would argue, is this thing called securitization. Now, what that really was intended to do was never to be inclusive in the way that we are thinking about it today, but rather to be exclusive, to create barriers, to create boundaries, precisely in order to retain or maintain the existing social order. Where did this social order even come from? Well, that's where this idea of the database society comes out. And now I'll shift to the last factor here, which is this question of AI and the big data project that's underway right now. The most tricky thing about AI, what is AI ultimately? It's a pattern recognition device. It's a technology which sees patterns in huge amounts of data. And if we are lucky, we sometimes are able to give names to these patterns. In the case of consumer affairs, it's much easier to do because you're looking for people who are spending and what they're buying. But when it comes to social life more generally, the question of how those patterns are put together is not visible either to the user or to the producer, the ones who puts it together, the code writer, because the mechanism of AI has a logic of its own, which is not always transparent or visible. In other words, what we are seeing today is that the threat being defined by AI imposed on big data is already intersectional in ways that we have not fully comprehended. In other words, it is now a combination of different kinds of threats which are being lumped together through the AI algorithm, and that has now become what Frontex and all these other mechanisms, devices, which are there in order to exclude, are identifying as potential threats. If you ask, what is the nature of the threat? The machine is unable to answer, and the user is unable to answer. But I think we can be confident that it is an intersectional quality of different kinds of vulnerabilities that are being lumped together in order to produce this idea of what is a threat. The ultimate, and this is, taking this argument to its ultimate limit, would say something like this. In the database society, in the moment of big data, when we still have either or categories of safe, not safe, secure, insecure, just, unjust, what we will inevitably end up with is a society defined around the idea that everybody is a criminal or everybody is a threat unless you can prove otherwise. So the burden of proof now falls on the subject to prove that they are allowed to be or should be or could be included within the social body. It is no longer a process of excluding those who are dangerous. It's assuming everybody is dangerous and forcing those within the system to say or to prove we are not. This is what I meant by saying society taken to the limit in this database world is one in which the latent, everyone is a latent criminal. And I'm using the word criminal in a loose sense. I just mean everyone has the potential to be excluded because that is now the nature of the intersectional threat production produced by an algorithm that has no master and has no meaning.
Can go on and on, but we must bring this session to a close. And I borrow the term that E.T. has used, story. So database doesn't tell you the story. The stories have to be built out of the database. But my question still remains that why are certain stories put into circulation? Why are certain stories acquired the mystic around them? And why are certain stories to be demystified? I think that these are the questions that we are left with. Maybe on another occasion, we will settle our questions and sort of sort out our doubts. So it's over to Somata, who will be proposing.
Thank you. Thank you, Shumita, and thank you to all our excellent panelists. We know that this is the festive season. Many of you are on holiday, although we are not. And I'm a little envious of those who do not have to teach right now. But thank you so much for joining us, to E.T. for joining this early in the morning, to Iman for joining pretty late, although I know it's not that late for you, and for Sevastri for making time for us. Thank you also to Shomirda for again joining us this late in the night and for also agreeing to moderate this session. We are leaving with the not so hopeful vision of what is here. If Iman thought he was being grim, I think whatever E.T. said at the end was grimmer. So, which is okay. But we are also looking forward to a new year. This brings us to the end of our 3 webinars. The first 2 of the series have already been uploaded on YouTube, and this will also be after we have edited it. This is a part of CRG's continuing engagement with the notion of security and prioritizing the question of human security. And this is a project that we are going to continue with in the new year as well. So hope you will be able to join us in our explorations in whichever forms they take. And thank you so much for being with us today. And yeah, see you next year. Thank you.